Hey guys, Chris from Drift Outfitters here, and today we're going to tie an October Bright. This is a cool fly designed by Marty Howard, really popular steelhead fly all over the place. Great bright poppy kind of colors, really stands out in the water. So this hook here, this is a blue heron, size 2, tie it on your favorite salmon hook, whatever you like. And then for thread, I've got, this is just an orange A-dot Veevus here. I'm going to start this thread just behind the eye. Just start it. This is a return eye hook, so it's got the doubled over wire. So I'm just going over that doubled over wire to bind it down quickly here. And this is a dubbed body fly, so we don't need to be too precise about thread wraps covering the body, but more or less touching turns just to build up a good thread base for us is definitely preferable. So I'll just take that down. This is a big hook, so it'll take us a sec to get all the way down here. Now on these sort of shallow sloping hooks, I don't like to go too far down the bend here, but I'll take it down to be just about in line with the point of the hook here. So you can see I've got the point here in line with the thread. And for our tip on this fly, we're going to be using, this is a small silver tinsel from Veevus here, small oval tinsel, I should say. I'll take a length, a few inches long like so, and I'm going to tie this in on the far side, just like so. Pull it back and take touching turns of thread over top of that silver tinsel. Back in around maybe almost halfway between the point of the hook and the barb of the hook. And then I'm going to take my thread back again in touching turns toward the point, like so. Now our tinsel, we're going to make a wrap starting behind the rearwardmost thread wraps, so we aren't leaving any bare thread exposed, and then coming forward good tight, overlapped there a little bit, good tight touching turns. Gonna make about 3 wraps here. And now when tying off a tip, which is this little tinsel section, what we call it, we want to tie in this tinsel just before it overlaps with our initial tie-in point of that tinsel. If we make an additional wrap over top of that, it's really not going to harm the fly a whole lot, but it will leave a little bit more of a bump in that spot because you're overlapping the 2 lengths of tinsel. So I'm trying to tie in just before it overlaps that point once more, and then I'm going to fold this tinsel forward toward the front of our hook and wrap back over it so that both the initial length of tinsel that I tied in and my securing tag end here, each length is parallel to each other right next to one another. And that gets you just like a nice smooth looking sort of base for your tag to be wrapped over. It's not extremely critical that you do that, but it does add a nice effect. Now for that tag, we're going to be using some just yellow floss here. I've got some silk stuff here, but Veevus floss is great for this too. And just a nice light yellow. And what I'm going to do, because this is going to be a fishing fly, and I don't want this stuff to unravel, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tie this in, so I have a short length, almost like I'm tying a tail here, off the back, like so. And I'm going to fold this back, and I'm going to start wrapping this longer end over my thread wraps, going back toward the tinsel there. And as I make these wraps, just pulling up on this short little end to make sure it stays on top. So I'm going to go right back to the tinsel here, try to make one good wrap just at the edge of that tinsel so that it covers up all my thread wraps, and then I'm going to start reversing my floss here and winding back toward my tying thread. And in the process, what you can do is as you get toward the front, overlap your wraps just slightly more with each consecutive turn, and what that will do is build up a little bit of a taper going toward the eye here. Again, not very critical into how this fly will fish, but makes for a nice look. And I get up here, cross that off, tie it off, snip off the excess. And the reason we left this little end here is because now what we're going to do is we're going to fold it forwards nice and tight over the top, and that will just bind and contain all of those floss fibers and keep them from slipping around. So when we're fishing it shouldn't get too beat up on us ever. Now for the tail is going to be a golden pheasant crest. So I've got some crests here, and I'm just going to pluck one out. We want to shoot for a crest that's roughly the length that we actually want to tie it in at, even though we could grab a really large one and tie it in short. The stem of this feather gets thinner and thinner toward the tip, and so it becomes harder and harder to keep it straight and to tie it in the way we want to. It's much easier to tie it in toward the base, toward this white stuff at the base of the feather. So I'm eyeballing that to be about the length I want. The length, generally speaking, is about 1.5 times the gap here of the hook. So in around that or so, just eyeballing it. Everybody has their own kind of style when it comes to these things, and the height is generally no more than a single hook gap in height. That said, I like a lower set tail, and so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take my thumbnail, I'm going to put underneath this feather, I'm going to pull down on it slightly. What that's doing is just sort of creasing this feather, breaking the back of it, and opening up its curve. Like so. Now that's a little rough. I can do that better. And what I will do, actually, easier way to do it even still, is tie it down on top of the hook here. Just loosely, or not loosely, but roughly. Doesn't have to be perfect. We're not going to leave it here. Take your scissors. I shouldn't demonstrate that with an open blade. Closed blade, back of the scissor, pull down on the tail and push up with your the edges of your scissor blades. And that will achieve the same thing. You just want to be careful to try and keep it straight. That's the biggest thing here. You don't want, because this can put a twist into the feather if you aren't careful, you don't want to do that. You just want to lessen that curve a little bit. And this is purely aesthetics and to your liking. But these flies, they aren't necessarily the most practical sort of guide flies. They're fun flies to tie. And so you might as well have some fun tying them and see what kind of effects you can make. So I like a sort of open, low set tail. So you can see it might even be a little shallower than one hook gap there, but again, roughly kind of measure up, 1.5 for the length. I'm going to strip off some of that fluff at the base there, and I'll just set this on top. I'm actually tying over a little bit of this fluffier stuff at the base here. Just gives me a better grip, less likely that this topping is going to twist on me. Now it actually did twist a little bit there, but not too badly. Can just sort of tweak it like so. Now I really like on these sort of more modern hooks, if you want to call them that, these with the slider bend, the low set tail, I think really does look good with them. So that's our tail tied in. Snip that off, put a few more wraps on top just to really seal the deal there. Now this tail does have a veiling. For that, it's a Kingfisher. If you don't have Kingfisher, you can use just like a blue hen hackle, but that's our Kingfisher patch there. I'm just going to pluck off a nice looking feather from here. These are really nice, intense blue, these feathers, like so. So I'm going to lay this, the idea is just over top of the feather. I usually aim for this veiling to go just a little past my tip back here and be like, end right around the point at which this tail starts to really curve upwards. So I'm looking at that. strip off, again, some of that fluff at the base here. Probably could have grabbed a slightly smaller feather for this purpose, but that's all right. Again, choosing, you know, correctly sized feather, if you want to call it that, off the bat will be easier to tie in because you'll be dealing with a thicker stem and it won't want to roll as much on you. But the idea here is just to get this position more or less on top, like so. You can see there's a little bit of curve in this crest. That's a natural curve that comes off of the head. If you really care about getting this perfectly nicely tied, if this is just a display fly, you can steam these feathers and wash them and dry them and do all sorts of things to manipulate that, but for a fishing fly, I'm not too concerned about that. Now the rib is a little bit more modern material. We've got some pearl tinsel here. This is a large pearl tinsel from Veevus. Going to take length of that. Just going to tie it in on the far side. I'm not worried about tying this in the full length of the body. You certainly could. It's such a thin material that it really doesn't add much bulk to the fly. And this is also going to, as they say, be a dubbed body fly. So it's not going to reflect every little detail in the underbody as well. So we can get away with that there. Now, there's a secondary rib. This is that same oval tinsel we used for the tag, but in a, or the tip rather, but in a medium. So a little bit of a larger size. And I'm going to tie this in on that far side as well. You'll see this, I am tying the full length of the body. And where I want this to end up, if my pearl tinsel's on top, I want my oval immediately below it in the same line here. And that's because when I start wrapping my ribs, I want this silver tinsel, not wire, silver tinsel to trail immediately behind my pearl. And that will allow me to do that. So that's tied in there. Now the body's pretty simple. It's 3 colors of dubbing. So I've got, this is a little bit of seal fur here, dyed yellow to begin with. Just take a pinch of that. You can use dubbing wax if you want with this stuff. If you have good dubbing, then it should be on the softer side and shouldn't be too unruly. You should be able to work with it without wax. But do whatever you feel comfortable with. Seal fur is pretty wiry stuff, so start with a little, build up. Start with wraps right at the back. And I want this body roughly divided by thirds. So 1/3 yellow, 1/3 orange, and 1/3 red. So just sort of eyeball what that's going to look like. Oops. Throw a little bit more on there and then we'll move on to the next color. There we go. So we've got our yellow on. Just to show you another option, if you don't have seal, synthetic stuff, STS dubbing, this is an orange. This is, I think, the best substitute you can use. It's not quite as translucent, but it has the same sort of bugginess to it. And when you pick it out, there is a fair bit of sheen and translucency that comes off it, so I think it's a very reasonable substitute. Works very well. So same thing, working my way up. This is going to take up, again, about 1/3 of the body. You can see I'm trying to keep a relatively even kind of profile to the body by diameter. Tiny bit more here and we'll move on to the red. This is actually a fluorescent fire orange, but leaning more red. It's a little brighter than red, which I like. Either looks great. Same thing. You could use a dubbing loop to attach this dubbing with, but it ends up being a little bit scruffier than I like. Play around with it though. Totally up to you. And we're going to work up to the eye here. We are going to leave ourselves a little bit of room before the eye. Don't want to crowd this thing. And you'll see I've tapered off my dubbing just slightly, coming down to the eye, so that I have a nice sort of thinner tie-off spot here that it just doesn't kick up my materials as much. I'm going to grab my pearl tinsel. I'm going to start wrapping. I'm looking to make 5 ribs on this fly. That's sort of the standard. And I just want to space them out evenly. That's my sole concern right now, is 5 and do it evenly. So it's 3, 4, and 5. Make sure you do pull good and tight. Make sure it bites into that dubbing so it really seats down well and doesn't slide around. So that's our first rib, and now we have that second rib. And so again, I tied in right below my pearl tinsel, so now when I start wrapping, it's going to naturally just trail the backside of my pearl tinsel. And just check intermittently, make sure it's actually following the line that you want. If you start the wrap of oval on the flat pearl and let it slide back, that will very easily sort of align the two for you. When I get to the front, cross that off with our thread and make a few good tight wraps. And that's our body, simple as that. Dubbed bodies are great because they actually do add a lot of motion to the fly, and very easy and quick to tie. So you can brush this out a little bit if you want. You want to be careful not to overdo it. So we'll brush this out a bit. Again, if you overdo it here, the fly kind of becomes a little on the dense side for my liking. It does affect the sink rate as well. But it does look good when you brush it out because that pearl tinsel and the silver just kind of glows through the dubbing, and it gives a really interesting look in the water. So that's our body. We're just about done actually. It's a pretty simple front part of this fly. We've got some black Schlappen here. That's going to be our hackle. So I'm just going to pull this out, find a nice looking feather. Something fairly large. This is a big hook. The blue heron number 2 is quite a large hook, so something with good long barbs is going to be the key here. So this is a very large Schlappen feather. I'm going to strip off the fluff from the base. I think you get better control over the density if you do strip one side of this feather. So assuming that you're a right-handed tyer, if you're looking at the feather, it's got a curve like so. If you face it so the curve is just in your perspective, facing away from you, so it's curving away, you're going to strip off the left-hand side of this feather. Okay, so I'm just going to flip this around. So this is going to be right hand for you, but flip it around. That's how you'd look at it. Strip off the left side, leave the right intact. That's assuming you're tying in by the tip and wrapping that way toward the base of the stem. So I've stripped that off, gonna tie that in right where I clipped off those materials. I'm gonna fold that tip back here, make sure it doesn't slip out. Give that a little snip. And then we're just gonna start wrapping. And density is up to you again in terms of how you want this fly to fish. A denser fly is going to sink more slowly. It will maintain a little more profile and faster flows, but have less motion and slower ones. So that's 3. Might go with 1 more here. This is a big hook, as I say, so yeah, I think 4 looks good. I just kind of pre-strip all the rest of my fibers off there. Make the tying point a little cleaner. I cross that off and tie it back. And that's our hackle. Very simple hackle. You could use other materials. You could use heron hackle. You could use ring neck, whatever you like. You can see it's got a really nice contrast to the body colors there. Very fishy look. And the last thing is the wing. The wing, I think, is probably what holds back most people from tying flies like this, but it's quite simple. once you get a little practice. I'm going to use some white tip turkey. The original was tied with a peacock secondary, but you will find that it can be tough to find peacock secondaries with fibers long enough for some of these larger hooks. So I actually really like the look of turkey on these things. Hopefully Marty doesn't get too mad at me for making this little adjustment. So I like to incorporate some of the white tips. You could tie with this stuff too. Important that you have slips from both sides, a left and a right. Now this is a center, what I would call center feather, has a very slight curve to the stem, but it's pretty straight. So center feather just means that it's a nice straight line. Sometimes you'll see feathers that will curve more to the left or the right, in which case you'll want two opposing feathers with opposing curvatures to them to be able to match up your slips. But the centers, usually you can use one feather for both sides. So I'm going to come in on the side here. I'm going to part these fibers here, and I'm going to pull off a slip. There's no marrying in this fly. This is a single strip wing fly. If I look at that, that's a little thinner than I want this wing to be for this size hook. I'm going to be a little more ambitious. I'm going to grab something a little wider. Something like that, maybe. I'm liking how that's looking there. So I'm going to snip this out. I find it much easier on these to cut out the fibers as opposed to trying to strip them off the feather. Stripping them off usually ends up with you jostling the fibers. So if we look, I might actually thin that out a little bit, but that's more or less the height that I want. Now I'm going to do a rough count. This can be a little annoying, but it does make for a better fly. Just a rough count of how many fibers I have here. And the way I do it is I take my scissor tips or a bodkin and I actually run them over the fibers, and you can feel the blades ticking over the fibers and kind of count them out. So it's 2, 3, 4, 5. It's about 15, 16 fibers in there. A rough estimate is good enough. You just want to make sure these are roughly paired up here. You can always adjust. So that was my right. I'm going to take my left now from this side. Similar area. I want a similar curvature and everything to it. I'm just going to, before snipping it out, roughly do that count. So that's 3, 5, 7. So it should be roughly the same size there, that slip. Again, I'm just going to come in and snip it off the stem. I'm going to take both these slips now. I'm going to put them back to back so that they mirror each other and curve inwards toward each other as well. So they're paired up now, have a very thin profile over top. The wing you want to tie in with the longest tips on the top side here. So I'm just going to kind of look at how this is going to sit if I tie in with this broad wing. I think that is a little tall, so I am going to, with them paired up, just pull a couple fibers off this bundle here. Start just taking a couple off. You can always adjust from there. You don't want to take too much off to start with. It's not bad, but I think I did overdo it just a tad, so probably would have been better with that initial clump if I had just taken that slip. I think that's looking pretty good though. So next thing I want to do here is I want to what we call hump these wings. So right now it's kind of straight, it's kind of a boring looking wing. Those humps that you see where the wing comes up and sort of settles out, that's all done before mounting the wing by basically holding the tips and holding the butts so that the fibers don't get out of line, and you just kind of push on them and curve them to your liking here. It might take a little fiddling. You'll find that they are pretty malleable, so you can actually really play around with it. That's a very ambitious hump. I need it to be a little longer anyways. You can see how you got the shape now, a really classic kind of shape. Now, I like my wing to be a little short of the tail. I like a longer tail, slightly shorter wing. My wing I'm looking to take back to maybe about halfway down the tail here. That's about right on ways longer hooks, I think. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold this right on top of the shank. I'm going to take my left hand and grip this wing right over top of where my thread is. I'm going to hold it really tight. I'm going to take my thread. I'm going to make a loose turn over top of the wing, all the way around, back up to the top. And now I'm going to pinch tight with my hand here so that my fingertips actually turn white. Really tight grip. And I'm just going to very slowly pull down with my thread so that loop of thread is sliding down between my fingers. And as I feel it slide down between my fingers, I'm going to, if you can imagine, roll back my grip. So I'm still gripping tight, but I'm gradually allowing my thread, that loop of thread, to slide between my fingers all the way down. I'm going to pull up real tight. I'm going to make another couple tight wraps without releasing, very key, without releasing my grip here. These butt ends, in the meantime, have become twisted. If I don't correct these, it could actually jostle the wing. So without releasing with this hand, I grab these and I twist them back to bring them up pretty well straight. And hopefully, if everything went right here, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's not bad, but to be honest, it's a little bit rolled on this side, if you can see it, just the tiniest bit. So we might see if we can fix that here. So we're not going to freak out. We just take a couple wraps off. The nice thing is that the wing actually does kind of retain its shape and the compression point that we tied it in. So you can see how that's already pinched down, and it's going to make the whole process the second time around, in some regards, easier. So same thing. Wrap up, around, death grip, pull up nice and tight, and then a couple more real tight wraps. Twist the butt ends back. Let's see what that looks like this time. That's looking better, I would say. Now these tips, they became a little misaligned, that's fine. They're still very workable and are going to get torn up as soon as we fish this fly anyway. So it really doesn't matter a whole lot, but I've got that. Just play around with it. You can still, play with the shape of the wing a little. Make sure you can get it to where you want it to sit. Ultimately, if the fibers, at the tips here become a little bit, uncoupled, unmarried there, then you can just kind of preen them a little bit, stroke them back, should sort of zip them back together. That's looking pretty good to me, I would say. I'm going to very carefully just tidy up this head a little bit. What you want to avoid doing is wrapping back over top any further over the wing, because you've just done all this work to properly compress the wing and really tie it in nice and tight there without jostling anything. Wrapping back over it could really screw things up. So consecutive tight wraps to lock everything down, but not going any further back than we've already gone. All right. Now very carefully I'm going to start trimming these butt ends away. Do not try and cut the whole thing at once because it actually will jostle this wing still. Instead, I usually hold the wing, come in with your scissors, separate a few fibers. Again, they're nice and tight with your scissors, and pull them away and cut it in sections instead. This is where a good pair of scissors, or even a scalpel, if you have one sitting around, is very handy. Or a razor, for that matter. If you're, a bass bug tire and you have a razor sitting around, you can very carefully use it to trim these as well. So that's them trimmed. We got away without really jostling the wing at all, so that's nice. And we're just going to tidy up this head a little bit. A little bit of tires wax on your thread here will help build up a nice tight head. We'll just cover up any exposed butt ends of that turkey. It's just a couple little thread fibers here somehow came undone. There we go. That's looking good. Come in, whip finish that puppy. Cut our thread. And get a little head cement on there. Make sure all that hard work is protected. And you know, as well as a plume of marabou on a hook catches fish, you know, there's something to be said about these slightly more intricate flies. They're a lot of fun to tie. They still catch fish really well, and they can add another kind of depth to your fishing and the whole enjoyment of it. That is your October Bright. Give it a go. I think you'll like it.